Tonight, Covid19 and Patient Zero, linked to US-funded research, show investigative reports, and new changes to New Brunswick's Policy 713, an attempt to safeguard the values of family life, or a failure to protect vulnerable LGBTQ children. We cover stories about the Kremlin's response to US-China relations, World Refugee Day and the growing forced displacements, US President's son to plead guilty. Assalamu alaikum and good evening. This is Muslim News Canada on Muslim Network TV. I am Catherine Bullock. A US-based animal advocacy group that tracks animal experiments says the first man to get infected by the Covid19 virus was a Wuhan researcher, Ben Hu. The advocacy group says Hu got sick in the fall of 2019. He was getting US financial support for research on coronaviruses. The group says documents obtained through its Freedom of Information Act request show the funding came in 3 grants totaling $41 million. The funding was given by USAID and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. The National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases was then headed by Dr. Anthony Fauci, former chief medical advisor to the US president. The Wall Street Journal reported 2 years ago that 3 Wuhan workers had been hospitalized with COVID symptoms in November 2019. The advocacy group says the first case of the virus is different from what mainstream media has been debating. Mainstream media has been linking the origin of the virus to the Hunan seafood wholesale market, where the virus is supposed to jump from an animal to a human. The documents reveal that no such animal has been found. Another report by 2 investigative journalists says 3 US government officials have identified 3 lab workers as the first cases of COVID-19. These journalists say 2 US-based grants ran from 2014 through 2019. A 3rd grant was cut off in 2020 by then President Donald Trump after the outbreak in Wuhan. Recent changes to the policy on sexual orientation in New Brunswick schools have ignited controversy. LGBTQ students and advocates are expressing their dissatisfaction. Premier Blaine Higgs's cabinet is divided. Social Development Minister Dorothy Shepherd has resigned in part over disagreement with these policy changes. Policy 713, implemented 3 years ago, aimed to create a safe and inclusive environment for LGBTQ students. Now, a few significant changes are causing a stir. Teachers will no longer be required to use preferred pronouns or names for transgender or non-binary students under 16. Parental consent will be mandatory for students under 16 who want to change their name at school. Additionally, the provision allowing students to participate in extracurricular activities based on their gender identity is being eliminated. Instead, students can engage in activities that are described as being in a safe and welcoming environment. Premier Higgs defends these changes, emphasizing the importance of parental involvement in their children's lives. A LGBTQ advocacy group disagrees, arguing that the original policy aimed to support and respect young people. Criticism also comes from a province's child and youth advocate. She says the policy reconsideration is based on only 3 complaints over a 30-month period. Premier Higgs says he is prepared for a leadership vote if his stance on parental involvement prompts it. First Nations communities are opposing a self-government agreement between the Métis Nation of Ontario and the federal government. The Chiefs of Ontario, representing 133 First Nations in the province, gathered on Parliament Hill yesterday to voice their concerns regarding the agreement. The House of Commons was supposed to vote yesterday on the self-government agreement. The federal government had signed self-governance agreements earlier this year with the Métis nations of Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. A parliamentary vote was the last piece left for the agreements to go into effect. The chiefs of Ontario are calling for a comprehensive review that includes the voices of Ontario's First Nations. They say they were not properly consulted. And not only do they want to be consulted, they want the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations not to recognise Métis Nations' jurisdiction over land until a proper review is done. Scott McLeod, a First Nation chief, has raised concerns about the possible infringement on First Nations treaty rights. He points out that Métis groups in Ontario have already signed agreement with industries and received funding designated for First Nations. Grand Chief Joel Abraham has raised another issue concerning the uncertainty surrounding the membership and ancestral ties of Métis Nation citizens. He says that many members of Métis Nations have ties to ancestors who are actually members of First Nations, not Métis. Métis are descendants of mixed Indigenous and Euro-American ancestry, usually dating back to the 19th century. The Kremlin is certain that China's relations with the US will not be turned against Russia. The Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov says China is a sovereign state and has a right to build relations with other countries, including the US. Peskov says Russia has a distinct relationship with China. He says China's relations with other countries will never be directed against Russia. Peskov's comments come after the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's recent visit to Beijing. And in related news, Peskov calls the meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and a delegation of African leaders in Moscow on Saturday very fruitful. The African leaders are seeking a peaceful solution to the Ukraine conflict. They discussed grain deliveries to Africa's poorest countries. On Ukraine, the Russian spokesperson says it is not the right time for peace negotiations due to Kyiv's current position. For more on Biden's son pleading guilty, please stay tuned. We will be right back. Today is World Refugee Day. A statement released by the Prime Minister's office says Canada is stepping up to resettle refugees. It says today there are more than 100 million people who have been displaced forcibly. And Canada, for the fourth year in a row, is the top country in the world to resettle refugees. On this day, the head of the UN's refugee agency says the number of people who have fled the fighting in Sudan is now more than 500,000. He says 2 million are internally displaced. Donors at a UN conference on World Refugee Day have pledged nearly $1.5 billion to combat the humanitarian crisis in Sudan and help its neighbors host those fleeing the fighting. More than 2 months into the fighting, the United Nations is voicing fears the crisis could spill over and destabilize neighboring African states. Authorities in the US and Canada are racing against the clock to locate a submersible vessel that was carrying people to see the Titanic wreckage site in the North Atlantic Ocean. The company that operates the vessel notified authorities on Sunday afternoon that the submersible was overdue after it departed for the Titanic wreck site earlier that day. A US Coast Guard told reporters at a briefing yesterday that the vessel has between 70 to 96 hours of reserves to keep people alive if there was an emergency on board. He identified the ship that took the submersible out to the dive site as the Canadian icebreaker Polar Prince. As of today noon, the vessel has not been located. 5 people on board the submersible. The search is taking place about 900 miles east of Cape Cod, where the water is roughly 13,000 feet deep. Canada and the US have each deployed C-130 planes. Ottawa has sent a P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol plane to the region of the North Atlantic. A submersible is different from a submarine. A submarine is able to depart and return to port under its own power. A submersible requires another ship to transport it and return it from a dive location. The US President's son, Hunter Biden, has agreed to plead guilty to 3 federal charges, including tax evasion and firearms charges. The US Attorney for Delaware, the prosecutor leading the case, has confirmed to a court clerk that Junior Biden is pleading guilty to 2 counts of willful failure to pay federal income tax. He says Hunter Biden is also guilty of another count of illegal possession of a firearm by a drug user. The attorney says the tax charges are misdemeanors. He says Hunter Biden is agreeing to certain unspecified conditions with respect to the felony firearms charge. Details of the plea agreement are not yet known. Hunter Biden has a long history of drug abuse and has publicly acknowledged his struggle with addiction on multiple occasions. David Weiss, the prosecutor leading the case, is an appointee of former President Donald Trump. The firearms charge carries a maximum penalty of 10 years imprisonment and a fine of $250,000. Thank you for watching. Sound Vision is a not-for-profit organization. It produces our news. We need your support for donations. Please scan the QR code on our broadcast or visit muslimnetwork.tv to donate now so that we can continue to amplify the voices of Muslims in Canada and abroad.